Cuba, an island nation just 90 miles from the U.S., holds one of the most fascinating and complex histories in the world. From colonial rule and slavery to revolutions, Cold War tension, and cultural vibrancy, the story of Cuba is one of resilience, struggle, and identity. In this video, we'll explore how this small Caribbean country played a massive role in global politics, became a symbol of both defiance and controversy, and developed a rich cultural heritage that still captivates the world today. Whether you're curious about Fidel Castro, the Bay of Pigs, or simply the soul of Cuban music and spirit, this journey through Cuba's history is not to be missed. The history of Cuba begins long before Spanish ships appeared on the horizon. For thousands of years, the island was home to indigenous peoples, primarily the Taino, along with smaller populations of Siboney and Guanahatibi. These communities thrived with their own languages, religions, agriculture, and social structures. They lived in harmony with the land, cultivating crops like cassava and maize, and fishing in the abundant Caribbean waters. This balance came to a devastating end in 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed on the island during his first voyage to the Americas. He claimed Cuba for the Spanish crown, marking the beginning of over 4 centuries of colonial rule. What followed was a violent and systematic dismantling of native life and culture. The Spanish initially saw Cuba as a stepping stone to more prosperous colonies like Mexico and Peru, but its strategic location and fertile soil soon made it valuable. Colonization began in earnest in 1511 when Diego Velázquez de Cuellar led an expedition to conquer the island. Resistance from the indigenous people was fierce, especially under the leadership of figures like Hatui, a Taino chief who fled from Hispaniola to Cuba to warn others about the brutality of the Spaniards. Hatui is remembered as Cuba's first national hero, though he was ultimately captured and burned at the stake. The Spanish introduced a brutal system of encomienda, in which native populations were essentially enslaved under the guise of being protected and Christianized. Forced labor, combined with the introduction of European diseases like smallpox and influenza, against which the indigenous people had no immunity, caused catastrophic population decline. Within a few decades, most of the native Taino population had been wiped out. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people were reduced to a few thousand survivors. To fill the labor vacuum, the Spanish began importing enslaved Africans in large numbers by the 16th century, laying the foundation for Cuba's racial and cultural makeup today. The indigenous influence, however, was not completely lost. Despite the near erasure of the native population, remnants of their culture survive in Cuban place names, language such as the word hurricane, derived from the Taino word huracan, and spiritual practices. Cuba, under Spanish rule, became a highly stratified society. Spaniards and their descendants controlled political and economic power, while indigenous survivors, enslaved Africans, and mixed race populations were relegated to the bottom of the social hierarchy. Catholicism was aggressively imposed, and native beliefs were suppressed, though over time syncretism blended African, indigenous, and European traditions into something uniquely Cuban. The long-term effects of Spanish colonization on Cuba were profound. The colonial legacy shaped the island's language, religion, agriculture, and social divisions. It laid the groundwork for centuries of inequality and resistance, elements that would later fuel Cuba's wars of independence and revolutionary spirit. In summary, Spanish colonization of Cuba was not just an act of territorial conquest. It was a process that erased an entire civilization and replaced it with a new social, economic, and political order. This era is both the beginning of Cuba's modern history and a tragic chapter of cultural destruction. Understanding this period is essential to grasp the depth of Cuba's national identity, its struggles for freedom, and the resilience of its people. Cuba's transformation into a global economic player in the 18th and 19th centuries centered around one thing: sugar. This white gold fueled the island's wealth and international relevance, but came at a devastating human cost. Behind the prosperity of Cuba's booming sugar industry was a dark foundation built on slavery, exploitation, and foreign economic dependence that would shape the nation's trajectory for centuries. Following the decline of gold mining and initial colonial endeavors, Cuban landowners discovered that the island's tropical climate and fertile soil were ideal for cultivating sugarcane. The shift to sugar production accelerated rapidly, especially after the Haitian Revolution 1791–1008. 104 disrupted Haiti's sugar exports. With Haiti, the world's top sugar producer, in turmoil, Cuba seized the opportunity to fill the gap in global demand. By the mid-1800s, Cuba had become one of the largest sugar exporters in the world. However, sugar was an incredibly labor-intensive crop. To meet the growing demand, Cuba turned increasingly to the transatlantic slave trade, importing hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, it's estimated that over 800,000 Africans were brought to Cuba. These individuals were forced to work under brutal conditions on sugar plantations, enduring long hours, heat, malnutrition, and violent punishments. Families were torn apart, and many died young. Entire generations lived and died in bondage, their lives fueling the wealth of plantation owners and the colonial elite. The Cuban economy became deeply intertwined with slavery. Large plantations, known as ingenios, dominated the countryside, and sugar exports became the primary source of income for the island. Even as global sentiment began turning against slavery in the 19th century, economic interests in Cuba clung to the system. Slavery was not abolished in Cuba until 1886, decades after many other countries had ended the practice. Alongside slavery, another consequence of sugar production was Cuba's growing dependence on foreign markets, particularly the United States and Spain. Cuba exported the bulk of its sugar to the U.S., and this created a pattern of economic vulnerability. If sugar prices dropped, or if trade was disrupted, the entire Cuban economy suffered. This one-crop dependency made Cuba rich but fragile. Additionally, land ownership became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small elite, both Cuban-born and foreign investors, creating stark inequalities. Wealth was not just economic, it translated into political power. Those who controlled sugar controlled Cuba, and they fiercely resisted any changes that might disrupt their profits, including abolitionist movements and independence efforts. The legacy of this era is still visible in Cuba's demographics, culture, and class structure. African cultural influences, music, religions such as Santeria, food, and dance, became deeply embedded in Cuban identity, a powerful testament to the resilience of enslaved communities. At the same time, the stark inequalities and injustices created during this period would later fuel political movements seeking reform, revolution, and redistribution. In conclusion, the sugar industry was both a blessing and a curse for Cuba. It brought prosperity and international recognition, but it also entrenched a system of racial oppression, economic exploitation, and dependence that would haunt the island for generations. To understand modern Cuba, the roots of its revolutions, its cultural diversity, and its economic struggles, you must first understand the era when sugar ruled everything and slavery paid the price. By the mid-19th century, the Cuban people had grown deeply discontented with Spanish colonial rule. Despite Cuba's economic success as a major sugar producer, most of the wealth remained in the hands of Spanish elites and loyalists. Meanwhile, native-born Cubans known as criollos, mixed-race populations, and recently freed African descendants faced political exclusion, economic inequality, and lack of representation. These tensions set the stage for a powerful national movement, one that would fight for freedom, identity, and sovereignty. The first major uprising came in 1868, when landowner Carlos Manuel de Cespedes freed his enslaved workers and declared Cuban independence, launching the 10 Years' War. This conflict was fueled by demands for self-rule, racial equality, and an end to economic exploitation. Though the war demonstrated the Cubans' commitment to freedom, it ultimately ended in 1878 with the Pact of Zanjan, a compromise that granted limited reforms but no independence. Still, the movement laid the ideological and emotional groundwork for future struggles. Following a brief period of relative peace, Cuba saw another failed attempt at liberation in the Little War La Guerra Chiquita in 1879–1880. It wasn't until the 1890s that the independence movement re-emerged with renewed strength and better coordination. This time, the charge was led by the revered poet, intellectual, and revolutionary José Martí. Martí founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party and tirelessly rallied support, not just within Cuba, but among exiled communities in the United States and Latin America. He envisioned a free Cuba that was inclusive, democratic, and independent of all foreign domination, including from the U.S. Tragically, Martí was killed early in the 1895 revolution, but his ideas became the soul of the Cuban cause. The Cuban War of Independence 1895–1898 saw intense guerrilla warfare between Cuban rebels and Spanish forces. Cuban fighters used scorched earth tactics to destroy sugar plantations and disrupt the colonial economy, hoping to weaken Spain's grip. The war was brutal, and Spain responded with harsh repression, including the use of reconcentration camps under General Valeriano Weyler, where thousands of civilians died from starvation and disease. By 1898, the United States, concerned about its economic interests in Cuba and increasingly sympathetic to Cuban suffering as portrayed in sensationalist American newspapers, entered the conflict after the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. This marked the beginning of the Spanish-American War. In a matter of months, Spain was defeated, and the Treaty of Paris 1898 was signed. Cuba was granted independence, but it came at a cost. U.S. intervention replaced Spanish colonialism. Though Spain was gone, Cuba now faced a new challenge, navigating its sovereignty under the shadow of a powerful neighbor. The U.S. occupied Cuba until 1902, setting up political and legal systems favorable to American interests. Most importantly, the U.S. forced Cuba to adopt the Platt Amendment, which gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and control its foreign policy. This amendment also granted the U.S. a permanent lease on Guantanamo Bay, which it still holds today. Though Cuba became officially independent in 1902, many Cubans saw it as a puppet state. The ideals of Martí and other revolutionaries had been compromised. This sense of betrayal deeply affected Cuban national identity and fueled anti-imperialist sentiment that would later inspire the 1959 revolution. In summary, Cuba's wars of independence were not just battles against Spain. They were struggles for dignity, equality, and real sovereignty. While these wars ended colonial rule, they also introduced new forms of control and foreign dominance. Understanding this chapter is essential to grasp why future generations of Cubans would continue to fight, not only for independence but also for self-determination on their own terms. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 wasn't just a political upheaval. It was a defining moment that changed the island's destiny and reshaped global geopolitics during the Cold War. At its center was Fidel Castro, a charismatic and determined leader who rose from the fringes of Cuban politics to topple a powerful U.S.-backed regime. His revolution would not only challenge the status quo in Latin America, but also ignite debates worldwide on freedom, socialism, and sovereignty. In the 1950s, Cuba was ruled by Fulgencio Batista, a former army sergeant who had initially seized power in the 1930s and later returned through a military coup in 1952. Batista's regime was marked by authoritarianism, censorship, and widespread corruption. While foreign investment, especially from American businesses, fueled some growth, most Cubans lived in poverty and political dissent was violently suppressed. Havana became a playground for wealthy tourists and the American mafia, while rural and working-class Cubans suffered neglect, poor education, and lack of health care. It was during this time that Fidel Castro, a young lawyer from a middle-class background, began to emerge as a revolutionary figure. Disillusioned by the failure of legal and political means to bring change, Castro led a small armed group in a failed attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba on July 26, 1953. Though the assault failed and many of his comrades were killed or captured, it became a symbol of resistance. During his trial, Castro delivered a famous speech titled "History Will Absolve Me," outlining his revolutionary vision and condemning the Batista regime. After serving time in prison, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he regrouped with his brother Raúl Castro, Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara, and others. In 1956, they returned to Cuba aboard a small yacht named Granma and launched a guerrilla war from the Sierra Maestra Mountains in southeastern Cuba. Though initially few in number and poorly equipped, their movement gained momentum through grassroots support, bold tactics, and widespread dissatisfaction with Batista's rule. Over the next 2 years, Castro's 26th of July movement grew in strength. Rebel forces used guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and propaganda to undermine the Batista regime. They promised land reform, social justice, and national independence, messages that resonated deeply with Cuba's rural, poor, and urban youth. At the same time, Batista's regime was losing legitimacy internationally, especially after reports of human rights abuses emerged. By late 1958, the tide had turned. Rebel victories in key provinces and the crumbling morale of Batista's forces signaled the end was near. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country, and Fidel Castro entered Havana to massive crowds and national celebration. The revolution had succeeded, but the real transformation was just beginning. In the years that followed, Castro initiated sweeping reforms. Large estates were nationalized, foreign businesses, particularly America-owned assets, were expropriated, and education and health care became state priorities. While these moves improved life for many ordinary Cubans, they also alienated the United States. Diplomatic relations rapidly deteriorated, and Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union, embracing Marxist-Leninist socialism. The revolution became more than a national victory. It became a symbol of resistance to imperialism and capitalism across the global South. However, it also led to censorship, single-party rule, and political repression. Dissenters were imprisoned, media was tightly controlled, and thousands of Cubans fled the island, forming a growing exile community, especially in the United States. In conclusion, the rise of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution marked a turning point in Cuba's history. It was a rebellion against dictatorship, foreign control, and inequality, but it also ushered in decades of complex political and economic challenges. Whether seen as a liberation or a descent into authoritarianism, the revolution undeniably reshaped Cuba and left an indelible mark on the 20th century. By the early 1960s, Cuba had gone from a Caribbean nation in the U.S. backyard to a full-fledged player in the Cold War's most dangerous standoff, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 harrowing days in October 1962, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war as the United States and the Soviet Union clashed over missile installations in Cuba. This moment marked not only a climax in Cold War tensions, but also demonstrated Cuba's strategic significance on the world stage. The seeds of the crisis were planted in the years following the 1959 Cuban Revolution. After Fidel Castro took power and began nationalizing foreign-owned businesses, most of them American, relations with the United States deteriorated rapidly. In response, the U.S. imposed a trade embargo on Cuba and began supporting anti-Castro exile groups. The most infamous of these efforts was the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, where U.S. trained Cuban exiles launched a failed attack to overthrow Castro. The botched operation embarrassed the U.S. government and strengthened Castro's resolve to resist American influence. Fearing another invasion, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, eager to balance U.S. power and protect a fellow socialist nation, saw an opportunity. In a bold and secretive move, he agreed to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. Just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. These missiles would not only deter a U.S. attack, but also give the Soviets a strategic edge in the global nuclear balance. In October 1962, American U-2 reconnaissance planes captured photographic evidence of Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy was briefed and the crisis began. Rather than launching an immediate military strike, Kennedy opted for a naval quarantine, a term used instead of blockade, to avoid legal complications surrounding the island and demanding the immediate removal of the missiles. What followed were the tensest days of the Cold War. U.S. and Soviet forces were on high alert. Nuclear bombers and submarines were positioned, and the world watched anxiously as two superpowers engaged in a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. Behind the scenes, both sides sent secret communications, trying to find a peaceful solution. Fidel Castro, meanwhile, was furious. He believed a U.S. invasion was imminent and urged Khrushchev to launch a nuclear strike if Cuba were attacked, highlighting how dangerously close the situation came to catastrophe. Finally, on October 28, 1962, Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. public pledge not to invade the island and a secret promise to withdraw American missiles from Turkey, which were pointed at the Soviet Union. The crisis was diffused, and both sides claimed a form of victory. For Cuba, however, the resolution was bittersweet. While Castro remained in power and avoided another invasion, he was excluded from the negotiations and felt betrayed by the Soviet Union. The crisis revealed Cuba's vulnerability and solidified Castro's determination to maintain political and military independence even from his allies. In the aftermath, the U.S. and USSR established a direct communication line, the hotline, to prevent future crises. The event also led to the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. For the world, it was a terrifying reminder of how close nuclear war could come. In conclusion, the Cuban Missile Crisis elevated Cuba from a regional concern to a global focal point. It symbolized the peak of Cold War confrontation and showcased Cuba's unique position between two superpowers. While the missiles were removed, the legacy of the crisis endured, shaping Cuba's foreign policy, its relationship with both the U.S. and USSR, and its enduring role in global affairs. After the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, Cuba faced some of the most difficult years in its modern history. The collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba's main ally and economic lifeline, threw the island nation into a deep crisis known as the Special Period. With Soviet aid and subsidies gone almost overnight, Cuba's economy shrank drastically. Fuel shortages crippled transportation, food was rationed severely, and blackouts became a daily reality. The people of Cuba endured extreme hardship, and the government was forced to make limited reforms to survive. To generate revenue, the Cuban government opened the country to tourism, foreign investment in joint ventures, and even allowed limited forms of private enterprise, changes that would have been unthinkable during the height of its socialist model. These economic shifts, however, also brought new inequalities, as Cubans working in tourism began to earn more than doctors or teachers. The use of a dual currency system, Cuban peso vs. convertible peso, further deepened economic divides. At the same time, Cuba's identity remained fiercely rooted in its cultural and political uniqueness. The government promoted pride in Cuba's independence, revolutionary history, and resilience in the face of global pressure. Literacy rates stayed high, the healthcare system remained free and widely praised, and arts and education flourished despite material shortages. Cuban music, dance, and literature continued to captivate the world, symbols of a culture that remained vibrant despite adversity. In 2008, Fidel Castro officially stepped down after nearly 5 decades in power, handing leadership to his brother Raúl Castro. Under Raúl, the government began a cautious process of economic and diplomatic reform. Restrictions on private business were eased, Cubans were allowed to buy and sell property for the first time in decades, and limitations on travel were relaxed. One of the most notable developments came in 2014, when the United States and Cuba announced a historic thaw in relations under U.S. President Barack Obama and Raúl Castro. Diplomatic ties were restored, embassies reopened, and Americans began traveling to Cuba in large numbers. It was a moment of optimism, seen by many as the start of a new era. However, this progress stalled and even reversed under the administration of Donald Trump, which reimposed sanctions and returned to a hardline stance against the Cuban government. Meanwhile, Cuba continued to struggle with ongoing economic challenges, shortages of food and medicine, a weak currency, and rising public frustration. In July 2021, the country witnessed its largest protests in decades. Citizens took to the streets demanding better living conditions, greater freedom, and government accountability. The response from the authorities was swift and harsh, with arrests and crackdowns that drew international criticism. These events highlighted growing tensions within Cuban society, between loyalty to the revolutionary past and a desire for more openness, opportunity, and reform. Despite these challenges, Cuba's cultural identity remains remarkably strong and globally influential. Afro-Cuban music, salsa, jazz, and reggaeton fill the streets. Religious traditions such as Santeria reflect the island's African heritage. Cuban art, film, and literature continue to challenge, inspire, and resist. Even in the face of economic hardship and political pressure, the Cuban people have maintained a spirit of endurance, creativity, and pride. In conclusion, modern Cuba is a country at a crossroads, rich in culture, proud of its history, yet deeply aware of the need for change. Its story is one of survival, reinvention, and cultural brilliance against a backdrop of political complexity. Understanding these recent decades is essential to fully appreciating the resilience and identity that define Cuba today.